This is a story about dignity after success, the kind that's tested when what you work for no longer stays. Jack Phillips stood in the doorway of the office longer than necessary, holding the plaque with both hands as if it might slip. The weight surprised him. Not heavy, just unfamiliar. His name was engraved cleanly, correctly, proof that the years had finally added up to something visible. Applause echoed down the hall behind him. Polite, earned, too loud for how quiet he felt inside. He smiled anyway. At his desk, Jack set the plaque down and straightened it twice. Then a third time. The office smelled faintly of new paint and coffee that hadn't been burned yet. Everything here was new. Title, schedule, respect. The word finally hovered in his chest like a hell breath. He opened his email, scanning messages that congratulated him with careful enthusiasm. Managers used his first name now. Some added exclamation points. Jack read them slowly, looking for something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Instead, a thought surfaced, uninvited and unsettling. What if this doesn't last? He closed the inbox and leaned back, listening to the building hum. The same hum he'd heard for years, just from a different chair. Same city, same sun pressing through the windows. Same Jack. On the drive home, he took the long way. Not to celebrate, to adjust. Success had arrived so quietly it felt like he might miss it if he blinked. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. 58. A little straighter than before, a little more careful. The face of a man who had waited long enough to be suspicious of good news. Lynn was cooking when he walked in. The smell of onions and garlic wrapped around him, grounding. Teddy lifted his head, tail thumping once, satisfied that the world was still in order. "Well?" Lynn asked, turning from the stove. Jack nodded. "It's real." She smiled. Not big, not surprised. The smile of someone who had believed before proof was required. Later, when the house settled and the night grew quiet, Jack placed the plaque on the shelf. He stepped back and studied it, hands on his hips. For a moment, pride warmed him. Then something else crept in, softer, colder. The strange feeling that success had arrived, already carrying its own ending. Jack turned off the light and went to bed, telling himself he was just tired. But sleep came slowly. And beneath the relief, beneath the recognition he'd waited decades to earn, a question pressed gently, persistently, as if testing the ground. If this disappears, what will still be true? The first sign wasn't the call. It was the silence that followed it. Jack noticed it in the way meetings ended quicker now, in how decisions were already made by the time his opinion was asked for, in the way his calendar, once filled weeks in advance, suddenly looked lighter, almost polite. At first, he told himself it was normal. Adjustments, budget cycles, corporate breathing. Success teaches you new kinds of fear. Not of failing, but of falling back. He kept showing up early, still wore the same pressed shirt, still listened more than he spoke. When someone thanked him, he nodded once, modestly, as if gratitude were a loan he didn't want to accept. At home, Lynn noticed a shift before he named it. "They don't lean on you like they did," she said one night, not accusing, observing. Jack rinsed a plate longer than necessary. "Things change," he said. She watched him carefully. "Do you feel changed?" He didn't answer. The email came 3 weeks later. Short, careful, professional. Words like restructuring, realignment, no longer required in this capacity. Jack read it twice, then a third time, slower. There was no anger in him, no panique, just a strange hollowness, as if the room had quietly expanded and left him standing too far from the walls. He drove home without music. In the driveway, he sat with the engine off, hands resting on the wheel. The house looked the same. Teddy barked once from inside. The porch light glowed steadily. Everything that mattered was still there. Yet something essential had been removed. Not violently, not unfairly, just taken back like a tide receding. Inside, Jack placed the plaque face down on the table. Not in shame, in uncertainty, as if it might answer him if he gave it time. Lynn read his face before he spoke. "They ended it," he said quietly. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. No words, no reassurance, just presence. That night, sleep didn't come. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every year he'd stayed, every sacrifice he'd justified, every belief he'd carried like armor. A question rose, sharper than the one before. If the reward is gone, what was I really faithful to? And for the first time, Jack didn't have an answer waiting. The days that followed moved more slowly, as if time itself had lost momentum. Jack woke at the same hour out of habit, made coffee for two, let it sit untouched while the house filled with morning light. Without the rhythm of work, the hours stretched in unfamiliar ways, exposing spaces he hadn't had to sit inside for years. He avoided the plaque. It stayed where he'd left it, face down on the table, an object suddenly heavier without being touched. Success, once visible, now felt like something fragile he wasn't sure how to hold. Maddie tried to act normal. She talked about school, about friends, about small victories that deserved attention. Jack listened, nodded, smiled when appropriate. But part of him drifted, not away from her, but inward where the questions lived. Who was he without the role? Without the recognition that had finally validated decades of staying? One afternoon, Jack drove past the restaurant where he'd spent most of his life. The sign looked the same. The parking lot was half full. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of someone behind the counter moving with the same practiced ease he once had. For a moment, resentment flickered. Then something else followed, relief. The job hadn't defined him as much as he believed. It had shaped him, yes, taught him patience, taught him restraint, but it hadn't owned him. At home, Lynn sat beside him on the couch, the space between them familiar and quiet. "You're not smaller now," she said gently. "You're just quieter." Jack considered that. The loss had stripped something away, but not the way he'd feared. What remained wasn't emptiness. It was exposure, a life no longer propped up by titles or schedules. That night, Jack finally turned the plaque over. He ran his thumb across his name, then set it back down. Not as proof, not as regret, but as a chapter that had closed without asking permission. For the first time since the email, Jack slept. Not deeply, but honestly, and somewhere between wakefulness and rest. A truth began to take shape. Not comforting, not cruel. Just clear. The years had not been wasted, but they had not been the point either. Jack didn't rush to replace what was gone. That surprised him most. There were days he sat on the porch longer than necessary, watching the neighborhood move through its familiar patterns. The mail truck, the same couple walking their dog, children riding past on bikes, shouting without urgency. Life hadn't paused for his loss, but it hadn't turned its back either. Friends reached out, cautiously at first. A former manager asked for advice. Someone else asked if he'd consider mentoring a new team. Nothing official, nothing promised, just quiet invitations to be useful without being visible. Jack noticed how different that felt. Before, usefulness had been tied to a role, a badge, a schedule. Now it came without structure and without applause. He said yes anyway, not because he needed to prove anything, because it felt honest. One afternoon, while helping a young supervisor navigate a difficult conversation, Jack caught himself listening the way he always had, patiently, fully, without thinking about what had earned him. The realization settled slowly. This part of him had survived the loss untouched. At home, Lynn watched him regain a different kind of steadiness. Not the confident rhythm of success, but something quieter. "Toa, you're lighter," she said one evening. Jack nodded. "I think I was carrying the wrong weight." He began volunteering at the local food pantry twice a week. Same hours, same early mornings, No title, no plaque, just work that needed doing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was back where he'd started, standing on his feet, serving people unseen. But it didn't hurt this time, because now he understood. The dignity he'd feared losing had never belonged to success. It belonged to how he showed up, even after success had walked away. And that knowledge, once earned, didn't disappear. Jack returned to the office building once more before the year ended. Not for a meeting, not to ask for anything. He brought a small box with him. Inside it, the plaque lay wrapped in an old towel from the truck. When he reached the lobby, he paused, listening to the familiar hum, the same sound that once meant arrival, then loss. He placed the box on the security desk. For the archive, he said simply, in case someone needs to remember how long things can take. The guard nodded, understanding more than the words suggested. At home that evening, Lynn and Maddie sat with him at the table, Teddy asleep nearby. No one mentioned the plaque. No one needed to. The space it had occupied on the shelf was now filled with something quieter. Photographs, handwritten notes, the ordinary evidence of years lived honestly. Jack looked around and felt no urge to measure his life anymore. The success had come, and it had gone, but what remained had weight. Respect that didn't depend on position. Faith that didn't ask for proof. A steadiness that couldn't be taken back. Jack realized then that losing success had not undone him. It had clarified him. He leaned back, listening to the house breathe, the world continuing at its unremarkable pace, the same way it always had. And for the first time, Jack understood something he'd never needed to say out loud. Nothing real had been taken from him, only what was temporary, and that at last felt like enough.